Well, the world's eyes are on Sri Lanka to look at both, of course, the unfolding political situation there, but as well as the lessons it has for the rest of the world on its economic collapse. Sri Lanka has been struggling for some time now, but that has come to a head in the last few months with its foreign exchange reserves completely deleting. A very heavily import-dependent economy found itself basically unable to pay for some of the most crucial items it needs to run the people's day-to-day lives, whether it's food, fuel, medicine. All of this affected as a result of bad policies over the years, coupled with bad luck as well, thanks to COVID lockdowns and so on. So what are the lessons for the rest of the world as Sri Lanka grapples with this crisis? We've got one of the world's most foremost voices on economics, Professor Kaushik Basu joins us. He's Professor of Economics at Cornell University, former Chief Economist of the World Bank, and of course, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India as well. Professor Basu, thank you very much for joining us. What are your big takeaways from Sri Lanka's collapse? Because in the neighborhood here in India, we are seeing, unfortunately, some eerie similarities playing out in, say, Pakistan and Nepal as well.
Nidhi, it's a tragic situation. It was, in many ways, uncalled for. And the kind of collapse that has taken place is beyond what one would have expected, even just 4 or 5 months ago. And there are drivers which some of which have to do with politics, which go back quite a bit. But let me dwell on the sort of immediate last 2-3 years. There were drivers. There were economic policy mistakes that were being made, such as, for instance, the rampant tax cuts, which were given by the Rajapaksa government in 2019. Moving the economy at great pace towards a free market economy virtually without taxes, which is quite crazy. And it began to show on the fiscal deficit building up. This is 2019. Then we do know about the ban on chemical fertilizer imports, which actually devastated the farming, put up a demand for food that they had to import, and that was also causing strains. Finally, and this is only beginning to come out now, it was clear almost 2 years ago that, and this was clear not to the outside world, but to the government in Sri Lanka, that their fiscal situation is in tatters, their international foreign exchange situation is in tatters. They were thinking of going to the IMF, but they turned instead to China, with which Sri Lanka has had a long-term relationship. And instead of taking the hard way out with conditionalities and trying to restructure the economy, they went in for another round of $3 billion worth of, roughly $3 billion worth of loan from China, which was simply postponing the crisis. You've got more money in hand, you can continue to spend. And China gets a grip over Sri Lanka in a way that was not expected earlier. You know, it's a bit like the old colonial times, when you take a big loan and the person lending you money, this is colonial times, also in rural India, very often when the money lender lends money, the money lender's aim is not so much to get the money back as to capture the collateral. In fact, the money lender hopes that you'll have difficulty paying back.
This is the Chinese debt trap that we've all been talking about. And you know, interestingly, China has been largely silent as Sri Lanka faces this crisis now. So it's actually turned its back on Sri Lanka when it needed its help the most.
Yeah, and Sri Lanka now is caught between the IMF and China. And if Sri Lanka goes all out to IMF is going to put tough conditions on all previous lenders, including China. So it'll be a fairly flat world, which will not be acceptable to China. So China is making it difficult, gone quiet, and in the meantime, Sri Lanka is left with this. But I must also point out, Nidhi, there are longer run problems that caused this brew to come up. It was the kind of political control that you were seeing from this family, the Rajapaksas, from authoritarian control, the lack of space for ideas, for debate, all was beginning to be cramped. There were charges of major human rights violations that were being brought against Sri Lanka. All this was being overlooked by a very authoritarian government. And now finally happened what we had not expected. The economy blows up in a way. Not being able to, defaulting on international lending is something that in Asia happens very, very rarely. And I don't think it has happened in independent Sri Lanka ever.
In fact, one of the things you had pointed out was that actually Sri Lanka used to be, as you said, South Asia's big success story. And it's so ironic to see it in this position today. And as you talked about authoritarianism, you also said the persecution of minorities, divisive politics, no sensitivity to farmers. All of this ultimately is what led them to crash.
I do think so. This hyper-nationalism that Sri Lanka was falling into for some time, drumming up and organizing against minorities, all this was playing to a political popularity. And we have to remember, till 3 years ago, this government was wildly popular. And one couldn't imagine this kind of a turnaround till the economy crashed so totally as happened today. In terms of standard of living and even per capita income, Sri Lanka even now is close to double India's per capita income. So it is a country which through its history had done very well, and it is really a shame for the very, very poor quality governance, very poor quality economic management that it has come to the dire state that it has today.
Are you worried that this could happen elsewhere too? For example, Nepal is facing, a foreign exchange crisis. Pakistan has been going through its own economic turmoil. Are you worried that this is not going to stay in Sri Lanka alone?
I am worried about it because there's no getting away from the fact that the global situation is difficult. The COVID-19, along with the Ukraine war, which causes a virtual halt to a whole lot of food grain coming out, fertilizers coming out, is causing strain worldwide. So it's a question of a little spark that can set the fire going, and that risk is there all over South Asia. Just that. Intelligent governance, and another thing is openness to data. Openness to information is so important because till 4 or 5 months ago, people did not realize that the situation is so dire in Sri Lanka because thanks to the strong government at the top, information was very, very weak. We were not getting the details of what's coming out, and the conventional Sri Lanka, quite some time ago, conventional India, where data is in the forefront, people discuss, people criticize, take corrective measures, was not happening in Sri Lanka at all. Till March, April, you look at the exchange rate, which was flat at 200 rupees to the dollar for several months. And it's called a soft peg. And the Sri Lankan soft peg is not a soft peg, it's a pretty hard peg. Then when it goes out of control from 200 rupees to 354 rupees over 2-3 months, the exchange rate is gone. This is the kind of mistake that has to be avoided, but there is a risk and a danger all around the world, including in South Asian countries.
Well, Professor Basu, one last question since you are here and we're talking about the world economy in crisis. What do you make of the rupee being so weak at this point? I mean, it's fallen to new lows almost every day in the last few days. Why is that happening, and how concerned should we be about this?
We have to be concerned about it because these things hover a little bit and then can go racing. The rupee just short or about to touch 80 rupees to the dollar, which even actually about 10 days ago, people were saying this could happen by the end of the year, whereas it is already happening now. It is worrying. At the same time, there is inflation, the rupee loses value. It's not too unexpected. The US has raised its interest rates, so money is flowing there. But we have to keep a very, very close watch because once again, Sri Lanka is a reminder. Small movements in exchange rate were taking place all the way up to March, early April, and then it flies out of control. So you have to come in with the right kinds of interventions, get the markets going much better than is happening. And there is no getting away from the fact that we'll be foolish if we look the other way and say that we are completely proof to this kind of a risk that Sri Lanka has faced.
I think those are wise, cautious words there, Professor Kaushik Basu. Thank you very much for joining us on NDTV today. Thank you.
Thank you.